श्रूयते वा? इदानीं श्रूयते वा? अस्तु, धन्यवादः। नमो विद्वद्भ्यः सर्वेभ्यश्च. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this truly wonderful event. I'm really honored to be a part of it. I have a few slides to share, so I'm going to try sharing my screen. Is it possible to Drishyate va? Yes. So then I can get started. So since this paper explores the connections between the Narayaneeyam and the Kerala School of Mathematics, I would like to begin with some brief remarks on Kerala's mathematical tradition. The Kerala School of Mathematics is generally considered to have been active from around the 13th century until the late 18th century. However, this tradition is actually far more ancient, as astronomical works are known to have been composed in Kerala as early as the 7th century. Although tightly linked to the Aryabhatan tradition that was prevalent in much of the Indian subcontinent, continuous reform and innovation in Kerala also led to several original mathematical works in classical Sanskrit, vernacular Malayalam, and the hybrid language of Manipravalam, and some of these have remained popular until fairly recent times. The Kerala school is unique because of several startling results that it produced on calculus and infinite series that predate similar developments in European mathematics by well over a century. Even a summary of the Kerala school's canonical works is beyond the scope of this presentation, but a few treatises of interest are mentioned on this slide merely as an indication of their scope and variety. The composition of the Ganita Yukti Bhasha and other mathematical works in Malayalam also reflects the sweeping linguistic changes occurring in the region at the time of their composition that made Malayalam an independent literary language in its own right and indicates the widening interest in the study of mathematics and astronomy in medieval Kerala society. This was the environment in which Bhattadiri's formative educational development would have taken place in the late 16th century. The scholars working within the Kerala mathematical tradition frequently wrote on much more than mathematics and astronomy. Many of them were equally proficient in astrology and authored a variety of works on various aspects of this allied discipline. Several mathematicians also straddled diverse intellectual fields. As representative examples across the centuries, it might be mentioned that Keralacharya, a royal minister of the 12th century, authored works on Jyotisha, Ayurveda, and Tantra. The astrologer Vidya Madhava of around the same period also wrote a fine commentary on the Sanskrit Mahakavya Kirata Arjuniya. The astronomer Kumara Ganaka of the 14th to 15th century wrote a manual on statecraft. The 16th century Shankara of Mahishamangalam wrote prolifically on mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and grammar in both Sanskrit and Malayalam, and Achyuta Pisharadi of the 16th century was a polymath who composed works in astronomy, astrology, poetics, grammar, and medicine. Even more significantly for our purposes, this same Achyuta Pisharadi was the teacher of the renowned poet and grammarian Milpattur Narayana Bhattadiri, perhaps most well-known among all of these above-mentioned names due to his highly popular Narayaneeyam. Bhattadiri was a key and influential member in the lineage of the Kerala School of Mathematics. According to traditional accounts, although he was a gifted student of Achyuta Pisharadi, Bhattadiri chose to focus on poetry rather than mathematics. The Narayaneeyam that he then composed continues to be read even today by devotees who connect to the outpouring of devotional fervor that the poet Bhattadiri learned to express by training under a mathematician. However, Bhattadiri also managed to include some characteristic mathematical phrases into his poem, perhaps in tribute to his teacher, and these chronograms have been so skillfully constructed as to be almost invisible. And Dr. Rangarajan briefly alluded to this in the concluding portion of his talk. The closing verse of the last canto reads, Ajñatva te mahatvam yadiha nigaditam vishvanatha kshametaha stotram chetat sahasrottaram adhikataram tvat prasadaya bhuyat dvedha narayaniyam shrutishu cha janusha stutyata varnanena sphitam leelavatarai ridamiha kurutam ayurarogya saukyam. So here it is, as Dr. Rangarajan already mentioned, it is traditionally accepted that the final phrase ayurarogya saukyam encodes in the Katapayadi notation, which was very popular in its use in Kerala mathematics, the date of completion of the Narayaneeyam's composition, which translates to the 28th day of Vrishchikam of the year 763 of the Malabar era, or November 27th, 1586. In his highly significant grammatical work, the Prakriya Sarvasvam, Bhattacharya notes that he was taught by a series of experts in different fields. His own father, Matradatta, initially taught him the Veda and Mimamsa philosophy, and he further learned the Veda from Madhavacharya, logic from Damodaracharya, and grammar from Achyutapasharadi. This account gives us some insight into the kind of multidisciplinary education that seems to have been not uncommon in this period. Besides his own scholarly contributions to grammar and bhakti literature, Bhattacharya also composed works on Mimamsa and wrote panegyrical poems in honor of various royal patrons, and several of his disciples later became accomplished literary authors in their own right. The example of Bhattacharya and the scholars cited earlier thus illustrates a close interaction and merging of the sciences and the humanities, making it possible that the kind of dichotomy that typically exists in modern education between these two, the sciences and the humanities, was perhaps not as pronounced in pre-modern India. With such porous borders separating fields of study, the possibility of the crossover of ideas from mathematics and astronomy into literature and vice versa becomes quite likely, and an examination of the relevant literature does reveal several instances of such harmonizing tendencies. This is especially evident in the Narayaneeyam of Bhattacharya, which is often seen these days simply as a work of devotional religious literature. But as Davis argues, while bhakti texts often do serve to mediate worship and ritual, they are by no means constrained to this sphere of activity alone. In a broader sense, bhakti combines with dharma to center and prioritize the ethical conduct of the householder's life well beyond the requirements of religion, purely in terms of worship. Even within this circumscribed context of religion, scholars often tend to think in terms of accepted and settled tradition, but as Schulman has pointed out, historically an impulse towards dissent was in fact the urge to break out of the paradox and realize the vision implicit in Brahmanical values. Thus, the bhakti philosophy evokes a perspective grounded in practice that accommodates change and evolution in place of static, eternal truths. Particularly in the practice of religion and ethical living, bhakti can encourage the exercising by individuals of principled choice that is in conformity with reason rather than following the mandates of authority and tradition. In the next section, I highlight this point of view by using two examples drawn from the Narayaneeyam to show that Bhattacharya incorporated scientific principles of observation and reasoning to develop the emotion of bhakti in his narrative thread centered around the figure of Sri Krishna as Godhead. Over the course of its 100 cantos, the Narayaneeyam describes the numerous incarnations of Lord Vishnu, but its narrative focus especially lingers over the life and actions of Sri Krishna, starting with the miraculous events of his birth and boyhood. As part of the Bhakti corpus, the Narayaneeyam also foregrounded a new form of religious practice that departed from the traditional Vedic formula of the sacrificial ritual, where the primary deity was often Indra, the king of the gods. In the 62nd canto that you see here, Bhattacharya describes Sri Krishna, a young boy of around 8 or 9 years, arguing vehemently with his father and other senior members of the cowherd community about the utter meaninglessness of offering worship to Indra to ask for the blessing of rain. Krishna states that rain is nothing but the result of adrishta, a term that I loosely translate here to mean a deterministic and even mechanistic process. And then he asks, by way of analogy, if the forest trees worship Indra since they are so blessed with plentiful rain. Krishna argues that if any entity is to be worshipped by the cowherds, it ought to be the mountain Govardhana, which provides grass and water for their cows and forest produce and firewood for their people. Still tender in years, he is already questioning and rebellious and seeking to overturn the established order. The reader knows that over the centuries, Sri Krishna is folded into tradition and indeed enthroned as the supreme authority, but the same devotional tradition still remembers and honors him as someone who did transform the existing order for something new. In the traditional story, Indra unleashes his anger through thunder and rainstorms. However, Krishna ultimately prevails. This rupture of the old system of worship, although brought on by rational thought and constitutive of progress, had once been feared and resisted by the cowherd community. But its memory is now absorbed into tradition and preserved in the devotional corpus as a heroic and celebratory act. Here, tradition does not imply the maintenance of an unchanging practice. Its participants are empowered to question, reason, revise, and reform its parameters within a framework that involves the participation of authority, in this case, Krishna's father and other senior cowherds, the exercise of reasoned debate, and the presentation of proof. Nor is the old belief system that is being sought to be replaced treated as untrue, as the story describes an angry Indra very capable of releasing cataclysmic downpours of rain. I will return to these issues and their implications in the next section of this presentation, and turn now to a second example, which is the second verse that you see on the slide. This occurs in the 61st canto, where the cowherd boys, lost and hungry in the woods, approach the Brahmana performers of a Vedic sacrifice with a request for food. Rebuffed and saddened, they return to Krishna, who instructs them to approach the wives of the Brahmanas instead, since these women have always been affectionate and devoted towards him. It is these women, through their selflessness and generosity towards Krishna and his cowherd friends, who unconsciously prompt the Brahmana ritualists to introspect on their own practice and spiritual growth, and to eventually recognize and accept the merits of the path of bhakti that their women so effortlessly demonstrated in their recognition of Krishna as worthy of their adoration and worship. Here, the challenge that is posed to authority does not manifest as a clash of competing ideologies. The devotion of the women is simply an alternate practice that has an unquestioned right to exist in a pluralist tradition. Within a pluralist framework, the exercise of any practice occurs in conversation with other existent practices, so that the process of self-inquiry, observation, evaluation, and reform remains ongoing and internally driven. When the Vedic ritualists recognize the transformative power of devotion to Sri Krishna, their acceptance of the bhakti path might entirely replace their ritual practice, or it may coexist alongside it. It is interesting that Bhattacharya's narrative account does not specify which of these two eventually happens, because either outcome is unimportant in a truly pluralist tradition. What is important is the process of remaining constantly aware, the capacity to analyze, and the will to reform and transform to continue to derive meaning in a constantly changing world. Returning now to the mathematical tradition of Kerala, it is reasonably evident from the frequency and contents of the works produced in the medieval period that the Kerala mathematical tradition was constantly evolving. This was not merely in terms of methodological concepts, frameworks, and procedures. Even the language of the texts themselves varied for reasons that are still not entirely clear between Sanskrit, Malayalam, and Manipravalam. Driving this process of change, it is not uncommon to see writers and commentators stress the need to continually re-evaluate accepted mathematical models and parameters for accuracy and continued relevance, and to modify or replace these constructs whenever they are found to be inaccurate and out of date. Such reform and replacement in no way implies that the old model was always inaccurate. Rather, a once accepted framework is generally recognized as having been accurate and useful at a certain point in space-time. However, there is a disciplinary understanding, very much as in modern science, that guiding principles must be constantly updated in the light of new knowledge and changing conditions in the world, so that mathematical results continue to remain accurate and applicable in the field of practice. As a member of the lineage of the Kerala school, Bhattacharya would have been acquainted with this empiricist philosophical outlook and sympathetic to it. So it is perhaps natural that similar principles are reflected when the opportunity presented itself in the context of religious and epic narrative. Resistance against the king of the gods, even when based on reason and righteousness, would have been a risky and forbidding enterprise. It is tempting to view this act as combative, or even from a modern perspective, empowering. However, in Bhattacharya's narration, Indra is not treated with denigration or scorn after being defeated by Krishna. Although chastened and made aware of Krishna's power, Indra still remains the supreme god of the Vedic sacrifice. Bhakti opens up as a powerful new method of spiritual practice that promises a direct connection with a personal deity. However, the ritualistic path still remains open and available for those who seek it. Further, the Orthodox Brahmanas who are habitually engaged in the performance of Vedic sacrifice recognize the limitations of their traditional ritualist approach and accept this new mode of devotional practice, first practiced by their wives. This acceptance is not precipitated through force, threats, or even ignorance, but follows from their own observations, analysis, and gradual conviction. Further, truth can appear in various forms. In the example cited here, the messenger of truth is a child in the first instance and a group of women in the second, suggesting that it is not merely the educated or priestly class that has a monopoly on truth. This approach finds echoes with the work of mathematician astronomers who argue for the updating of older, antiquated methods, but still preserve the earlier strata of knowledge and the associated older texts as historical disciplinary approaches that sought to realize the same vision and whose insights can still provide guidance. Such an attitude reflects a keen interest in innovation while maintaining a respect for earlier practice and resists a blind conformity to tradition. Within the school of Kerala mathematics, a slavish adherence to tradition would have made it quite difficult to break out of the standard methods of doing mathematics and embark on developing radical new techniques, as they did. Innovation was not penalized, but there was still tremendous value in being identified or allied with a tradition. Cultural equivalences in religious and philosophical texts may have helped to harmonize innovative mathematics with earlier practice, and may have helped in making the argument that these newly developed computational techniques were indeed allied with tradition. The work of these mathematicians could potentially be compared with the actions of the boy Krishna arguing for the worship of Govardhana. In their own respective spheres of action, both appealed to the intellect to present reasoned arguments against an established practice and to argue for a better way of doing things. This similarity of approach grounded the inquiry into new mathematical methods, but in the field of religious practice, the appeal to reason had even more far-reaching consequences by securing acceptance for innovative forms of worship and the enactment of dharmic living, as exemplified by the Bhakti movement. Here, the initial appeal to reason and logic had the unprecedented effect of allowing devotees to tap into previously unexplored depths of emotion and feeling to establish a personal and intimate connection with the suprarational and the divine. Thank you very much. Dhanyavada.
धन्यवादाः प्रिया नम्रत् इति इयं विदुषी अत्यन्तरमणीयतया केरळचरित्राणि विदुषां कैरळीयविदुषां चरित्राणि तेषां तत्र ग्रन्थविशेषरचनानि सर्वाणि अधिकृत्य भाषितवती। विशेषतः तत्र नारायणीयम् अधिकृत्य अन्ते विशदतया भाषणम् अनया कृतं वर्तते। तत्र च नारायणभट्टत्रिमहोदयैः भक्तियोगस्य यन्माहात्म्यम् अथवा यद्वैशिष्ट्यं प्रकाशितं वर्तते इत्येतत् अनया अति सुष्ठु भाषितं वर्तते। तत्र इन्द्रस्य विषये भगवतः कृपा कथमासीत् जनानां विषये भगवान् श्रीकृष्णः घोरवृष्टितः जनसंरक्षणं कथं कृतवान् तथा दावाग्नेः जनानां संरक्षणमपि कथं कृतवान् भगवान् इत्येवं रीत्या तत्र प्रतिपादितान् विषयान् अति रमणीयतया इयं प्रकाशितवती। तस्याः कृते अत्र भाषणम् अस्माकं कृते कृतवत्याः अस्याः कृते महान् धन्यवादान् समर्पयन् तस्याः भगवत्कृपया श्रीकृष्णस्य परमानुग्रहेण सर्वाणि तत्र श्रेयांसि सर्वदा भूयासुः इत्येवं रीत्या प्रार्थयमानः इदं वचनं मदीयं वचनम् उपसंहरामि नमांसि।